I'm here with Dr. Robert Talbert, a professor at Grand Valley State University. Is there any additional context that you'd like to give us in terms of an introduction?
Sure. First of all, thanks for speaking with me today. I'm a professor in the mathematics department at Grand Valley State University, which is in Allendale, Michigan, and I also work in a quarter-time appointment in our president's office as presidential fellow for the advancement of learning. And in my president's office role, I coordinate large-scale initiatives to improve teaching and learning at the university, including things like e-learning initiatives and online and hybrid course initiatives.
My initial impetus to speak with you today was a Twitter post I saw where you were referencing an article about change in student perceptions related to online learning. The article essentially said was that when online learning started, students did not like it. And if you ask them now, they do. And that matches my personal experience. I'm wondering if it matches yours and why you think that is.
Yeah, absolutely. It matches my experiences. I would when COVID hit, March of 2020. My department, mathematics department at Grand Valley, we'd had some online courses in place, all asynchronous, very few of them, maybe one a year. And I taught in some of those online courses before, and it was a niche audience. It was a little too not enough data to really say, whether students really liked it or not. But then we flipped a switch literally overnight and had to put over 100 sections of math courses, only 3 or 4 of which had been ever designed to be online, to online formats, and affecting over 1,000 students who were taking the classes. And it wasn't great at first because it was triage. It was an emergency online instruction, right? No, people were getting training on the fly. We were doing the best we can with what we had and trying to stay oriented and stay sane in the whole process. And so some things will go well in that situation, and some things will just not go well at all in that situation. And I was the chair of the department at the time we did this switch, and we collected some data from students to simply asking them what their experiences were like, and it was all over the place. Some students were having actually really good experiences with our courses, and some were having, maybe they had a professor that just wasn't technologically up to speed enough to handle the tools that they needed to have. What we found when we started looking at comparing ourselves with other departments is that we were actually doing a whole lot better than a lot of other departments in our college were. Across the board, students really hated the online experience, mostly because it was just it was put together at the last possible second, and you could tell. And that's going to be the case whether it's online or in person. If I had to teach a class outside my discipline or even in my discipline, and I had 24 hours notice or 10 days notice to put it all together, and it were in person, it would probably not be a very good class. I mean, even though I'm an experienced instructor. And now over time, as we have kept some of the remnants of our online experience, especially in the 2020-2021 academic year, and following the first COVID emergency, where we were still, social distancing, a lot of sort of staggered hybrid courses where half the class would come on one day and the other half would come on the other day. There was a lot of online presence in what we did by choice, and the more we did it, the more we thought about it, the better we got at it. It's kind of what we decided. And I think then you started seeing students recognizing the benefits of an online modality and instruction. And when it's done well, when it's done with students in mind and incorporating sound pedagogical course design principles, just like an in-person class that is well designed and uses good pedagogy and good course design, students are going to be pretty happy with their experiences. And so the differences we see about what makes a student like or dislike a course doesn't have really anything to do with the modality of the course, in my view. It's all about how much effort are you putting in to put students at the forefront and in the center of what you're doing. Aligning your teaching practices, are you aligning your course design with what we know about works best for students? This is something that transcends the modality of the course, and the more we do that, get students into the heart of what we're doing, the better the students like it. And it's not really surprising in retrospect.
Sure. How much of this do you think is about instructors, professors adjusting? How much of it is about the students adjusting? And how much of it is just about having better opportunities for preparation and reflection on design practices?
Yeah, good question. I think in terms of who's adjusting, whether it's the professors or the students, I think there's a positive feedback loop in play. I mean, as professors do better at learning what works and observing others and maybe just having a community where they can share their own failures together and be vulnerable about it, students feel a little more trusting that their professors know what they're doing. And then students begin to feel better about the process and adjust themselves. And I did notice a strong sort of self-fulfilling prophecy taking place at the very beginning of COVID, where students said, I just simply can't learn online. I can't do it. And I would sometimes drill down into that. And I said, well, have you ever taken an online class before? And they said, no. And so my question was, well, how do you actually know that you can't, like you physically, intellectually, psychologically cannot learn online? And it was just a feeling. And so once you got into a place where you could feel a little more vulnerable and have a little more trust with your professor, then you suddenly feel a little better about the whole online experience. And now I think students not only know that they can learn online, for not every student, it's not the best choice for every student. Let's be real about that. But I think every student now realizes that they could, if put into the situation, get a really good learning experience, no matter what it is and where it is. In fact, I encourage students to think of this as like a positive trait that they might take into their job applications. You know, go into an interview and saying like, a Grand Valley State student can learn anything anywhere. And it doesn't matter what the modality is because we've got the skills and the tools to put it all together. And if you start framing it as an asset rather than as a deficit, then suddenly the narrative changes. And it's also certainly true, as you said, that the tools themselves that we use for delivering online courses have gotten dramatically better over the last 3 years. I mean, Zoom itself, which we're using right now, I used Zoom pre-pandemic when I was in my sabbatical, and it was okay, you know, but it wasn't like it just simply didn't fail a lot. That's about the best you could say of it. But now it's like it's these video conferencing tools and whiteboarding tools and all the stuff that's web-based. It's really become highly optimized for good online pedagogy. It puts much less of a barrier, it feels like, between myself and good active learning experiences for my students these days. And that helps me to build that feedback loop again. If the tool's better, then it drives me to be better because I have less friction, you know, in my instruction. And then if the instruction's better, the student feels more competent and that makes them feel better and that makes my instruction better. So it's all kind of a virtuous cycle that all three of these participate in.
My first follow-up question, talking about pedagogical design, one of the big issues I hear from instructors who are sort of, maybe we would call them like in-person supremacists, or at least in-person preferences.
That's a great phrase. Great phrase.
Is about assessments. I'll just be straightforward with you. I am very much against having students be forced to sit and stare at the camera as a way of verifying their honesty in completing assessments. What are some assessment strategies that work that aren't just, you know, coercive for online courses?
Well, first of all, you're right to feel a little uneasy or extremely uneasy about the online proctoring and any sort of assessment that gives way to online proctoring. It's Orwellian and it creates a police state in your classroom. And this is completely antithetical to what good higher education ought to be. So what's happened in the rise of online education through COVID and up to now is I think we now realize that anything that any sort of assessment process that relies on the bottom two levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a hierarchy of cognitive engagement. It has 6 levels in it, and the bottom 2 are remembering and understanding, just like pure factual recall and very basic applications. That kind of stuff is no longer appropriate for timed assessment. If you're going to do it at all, it's got to be something that's very low stakes on that level. It's often it's not necessarily what you add to your assessment tool stack. It's what you remove from it that makes the biggest difference. The kinds of assessments that work really well for online instruction are the ones that are authentic and sort of robot proof. I mean, we can talk a lot about Chat GPT right now if you want to, and that's a whole nother wrinkle that's been dropped into the mix here. For example, rather than giving, if I teach mathematics, which is my discipline, I'm teaching discrete math to computer scientists, rather than giving them like very simple computational things to do on a Blackboard quiz or something like that, LMS quiz, which can very easily be done with a computer. If it can be done by a computer, it should be done by a computer, and just leave the human in the loop in some appropriate way. Like instead of doing that, give my students some sort of interesting application problem that involves using their human brain to set up a solution framework for an interesting problem that then pulls in the basics that you can see it applied in a really authentic way. That's much harder to fake. It's not unfakeable. Okay, it's not cheat proof, but it's much harder to pull off a convincing written proof to a mathematical theorem, for example, than it is to pull off a convincing solution to a basic calculus problem. And more to the point, it's more interesting for students. And I think students, my view is that students don't really necessarily want to cheat on things. They really want to learn things, and they're looking down their future. And it's not an easy future to look at. I mean, there's a lot of fraught situations coming down the line for my students. And the job market is only one of those. And the thing that distinguishes them from the job market is how well they can learn things. And they realize this. They don't really want to do shortcuts, but what they really want is assessments that aren't worthless. The reason people cheat isn't because they can, it's because they do a little cost benefit analysis in their brain every time they get a quiz and say, like, what's this really getting me in the end? And if the answer is basically nothing, then that's what makes people cheat. So the solution is to give students things to do that are interesting, that they will want to do. And this is a really challenging thing to come up with, but that's part of what it means to be a professor. It's part of the job.
In addition to what you said, I think another major factor in cheating, especially during the COVID transition time, was that students were immediately in a situation where they were completely overwhelmed, and different institutions offered different levels of support, both in terms of resources and in terms of offering strategies. So I think for learners today, it's not just about the lower levels of Bloom taxonomy or even the higher levels of Bloom taxonomy, but there's almost a meta learning where they are having to really be conscious of their own strategies and philosophies and what their plan is long term for how they're going to process complicated information. I don't really have a question there, but do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I'm nodding my head because you're totally right. And I think the thing is that's a feature, not a bug. Because higher education, the reason it's called higher education is because it's like meta education. You're learning how to learn things. I teach differential equations right now. I don't have any idea if or when any of my engineering students are going to actually solve a differential equation in their careers. I have sisters and brothers who are engineers, and they never have. They maybe have used them to think about things, but I don't know what students are going to be using the material in my courses for. Nobody can see the future, but I can definitely tell you they're going to have to learn some material on their own in the future. And so having to do this is not a defect of online education. It's actually what makes it really valuable. Challenging is, like you say, if there is little to no support in that process. So if I give my students something to do that requires them to learn a lot of stuff on their own, but give them no help on it, that is not a good situation for me or my students. If you want to learn and build the muscle, this is a great place to do this. And I can guarantee you a self-regulating learner is like worth their weight in gold in the job market right now. You talk to people who are in the private sector and what they're hoping to see from college graduates, and nobody says, well, they should solve a linear second order differential equation in their heads. Nobody says this. What they say is, in year one, we want these new graduates learning our system. In year three, they need to be running our system. And what this takes is a high degree of self-regulation, self-monitoring, and frankly, self-teaching. We talk about lifelong learning a lot in higher education. This is what it looks like. And so any opportunity we get to put students in that kind of situation and then give them the support to pull it off is a major win for higher ed.
Well, I mean, at some point we lived in a world where information was scarce. And so information was valuable because it was scarce. We no longer live in a world where information is scarce.
Mm-hmm.
And students have developed their own strategies for how they're going to navigate this. And I think when they see sometimes that we're trying to treat them as if they're living in a world that they're not, that kind of flips a switch where they think, this is really irrelevant to me. And I'm not saying they're right to cheat, but they may be right in perception of the misalignment of the assessment.
Yeah, it may not be a morally correct choice, but it's a rational choice, given the situation that they're put into, where we're giving them assessments and giving them grading structures and everything else that just make no sense, given the world in which they live. Computers exist, and so mathematicians use computers all the time, and yet when we look at most math courses in universities, computers are often banned. Like, why are we banning a professional tool that professionals need to know how to use well with their human brains intact, to be able to pull it off as a professional? Students are right to look at that and cast a judgment that that's complete nonsense. They're not right to cheat. It's not right to cheat, but it is completely unavoidable to feel like that's an unfair situation to be put into.
There's another question here, which we kind of hit on with about consent, treating students as individuals. To what extent do you think the instructor-student power dynamic needs to change in an online class, if any?
I think that the traditional instructor-student power dynamic is that the instructor has all the power, and the students are just sort of there and they need to get in line. Maybe that's too on the nose, but it is. When you look at a typical college classroom, even today, this is what you see. I mean, you do not see shared power in a classroom. You can even walk into the classroom itself and see that the power is not shared just by the way the chairs and the tables are arranged. I mean, look at what a typical college classroom looks like: rows upon rows upon rows of desks that are all facing forward to one central location where the instructor lives. Now, tell me that's not a power dynamic in play. And it plays itself out in every classroom that's set up that way, whether or not we choose to. What I hope that we get moving forward, whether it has to do with online education or not, is a sense that students are clients, okay, not customers. It's not really quite it. I mean, higher education is not a business. We don't make a product. I mean, the assumptions and values for businesses are one thing, and there's something different for higher ed. But thinking about students as our clients is actually pretty helpful. That's when we have a client that we're working with, or like designing a website for a client or whatever. It's you don't tell them what to do, and they don't tell you what to do. You're working together to build something that's of equal value to both of you. And if the client's not happy, then you should be happy either. And if you are not happy, then the client's not going to be happy with what they're getting either. So it's about working together in a collaborative sense to build something that's of value to both. And I think online education has the ability to kind of break down some of those power barriers. Honestly, not least of which is because we're not in a classroom. I mean, I just mentioned classroom. The design of classrooms, the architectural design of classrooms can mitigate this absolutely 100%. And the fact that when I teach an online a synchronous online course, I have all my students there at the same time, and we're all kind of just in the same place. It's a very flat playing field, honestly. We see each other as equals in some ways. And that's kind of cool. And I think students really can feel comfortable with that as long as they trust me. And that's another thing about having clients, is that the clients have got to trust you. And if we set up grading systems in the class where there's no trust involved, or if you treat students in a way that they don't have good reason to trust you, it doesn't really matter whether you're online or in person. It's not going to work.
When I was teaching in January 2021, very first thing that happened in my first Zoom meeting in class was somebody put in the chat, "We're going to have a Snapchat study group. Everybody drop your Snapchat addresses." And before I could say anything. And on the one hand, I mean, it's awesome. It's like so self-organizing and autonomous. And on the other hand, I kind of like immediately cringed and felt threatened. So it's kind of something to learn to navigate, I think.
It is. It's very hard for instructors, especially old people like me, to give up on the feeling that you are in charge. like you say, it's awesome that students are putting out their own initiative to organize their own study groups. I mean, isn't that amazing? I mean, that's what we hope for, you would think, unless what you really hope for is just to feed your own power hunger, in which case it's a terrible development. So I think all of this requires like a radical shift towards putting students at the center of what we do. I was back to that. You can take little steps every day to do that if you're an instructor and you're kind of struggling with this, like simply when someone puts the group me link or whatever it is in the chat, just chill out about it. You know, just say like, this is not going to lessen the academic rigor or whatever of my course one bit. It just means that people are studying together, and that's kind of awesome. So just kind of shift your brain in that one little way, and pretty soon the rest follows.
So I'm going to ask you a final question that's a little bit provocative from an administrator perspective as well as a faculty perspective. You think makes the traditional university competitive now that there is this wide array of options that's essentially available to everyone?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a real simple answer. Feedback loops on the human scale. That's what makes us competitive. And that's why I don't think, to the extent that universities can embrace the concept that we exist to provide students feedback on a human one-to-one scale, we're going to be fine. Okay. To the extent that we lose this, we are definitely not fine. Our lunch will be eaten by the boot camps and the MOOCs and the chat GPTs of the world, because anybody can give impersonal education. It's really easy to do. In fact, all you got to do is make a bunch of videos and put them on YouTube. When you're talking about getting in side by side with a student or a group of students, a small group of students, and helping them to grow and orienting what you do toward their growth, like that's why you're there. That is not something that can be replicated at scale at this time. And so that's where our value proposition as a university comes into play. And we lose that, you don't have any value proposition. There's nothing left.
I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. I've really appreciated hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for having me.